My name is Eric Frederick. I am the Executive Director of Connected Nation Michigan. We are here to talk about broadband today and the ever important topic of connectivity, particularly in rural Michigan. Just to give you a little bit of context, Connected Nation Michigan is a 501c3 nonprofit organization, and our mission as a nonprofit is to facilitate the expansion of broadband access, adoption, and use across the state of Michigan. We look at broadband infrastructure, which is the access. We look at broadband adoption, which is affordability and digital literacy. And we look at the use of technology to improve quality of life. So we don't just stop at looking at infrastructure, we look at everything involved with broadband, which is where we start to identify some of the challenges in the state and how do we close the digital divide for all Michiganders? And that's really our mission, is to solve that challenge. Um, my background is in urban and regional planning, so we look at community development. We look at broadband from a community development and economic development perspective, and bring that long-term comprehensive approach to solving the digital divide to broadband. We work with the state of Michigan in a number of different ways to solve the broadband challenge, including working with the Connecting Michigan Task Force through the Michigan Economic Development Corporation. We worked with the Michigan Department of Agriculture and Rural Development in the past. We work with the Department of Technology Management and Budget to help with the Connecting Michigan Communities Grant Program. We work with the Michigan Public Service Commission to map broadband coverage and figure out where service is and is not, which is, of course, the biggest question for rural Michigan is where is broadband service? Um, there have been a number of initiatives that have been implemented since the start of the COVID pandemic, which is going on a year ago now. Um, the biggest of which was some federal funding from the FCC that came down called the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund, or RDOF, as the federal government loves their acronyms. The Rural Digital Opportunity Fund provided $10 billion in subsidies to internet service providers across the country. And in Michigan, internet service providers won $363 million in those subsidies. And they're going to be building out to 250,000 rural locations in the state over the next 6 years. Most of the new connections that are being made because of that fund are 1 gigabit per second connections. So we're going to see a dearth of broadband construction starting here very quickly, so that those winners of the subsidies in that fund can get those connections out to those who need it. However, we're still going to be running up against two challenges even after that fund is implemented. The first of which is additional areas that did not get funding because of that program, and will still be left behind and disconnected. And two, we know that in the broadband world, just because you build broadband and the infrastructure is there, doesn't mean that it's affordable to everyone. And so tackling that affordability challenge is, I think, really the next big hurdle to climb for a lot of Michigan. Um, the FCC is also implementing a program called the Emergency Broadband Benefit. And this program is tied to the COVID emergency that's currently implemented or at the federal level and the state level, of course, as well. But the Emergency Broadband Benefit Program is going to provide a $50 per month subsidy on internet service to qualifying households. And households for that program are low-income households, vulnerable households, but also households that have experienced a substantial loss of income because of the COVID pandemic. Those households that have a Pell Grant in them. Also households that again, are low income, which could be anyone from households with kids on the school lunch program, on the free or reduced lunch program, or elderly households with that receive Social Security income. And so we're very excited to see this program implemented because we know it's going to help a lot of households in Michigan solve that affordability challenge. Like I said, we don't just look at infrastructure; we look at everything related to broadband, and really overcoming that rural connectivity and availability challenge is key, especially for Michigan's farmers that have businesses throughout rural Michigan, but two, to solve the affordability challenge for vulnerable populations where the infrastructure might be available but out of reach from a financial standpoint.
Thanks for that great introduction, Eric, and for the wealth of knowledge that you're sharing with us today. When we talk about broadband access and the struggle being real, per se, out in the countryside throughout Michigan, can you talk a little bit? You talked about the programs that are available and how COVID has impacted this subject, but are there any statistics that you're aware of when it comes to, access in those rural spaces here in Michigan? And then maybe how do we compare to some of our neighboring states or on a nationwide basis when it comes to access specifically?
Yeah, that's a great question. I live out in the country, so I struggle with my own internet connectivity. Um, but when we compare Michigan to some of our neighbors, we're pretty much right in the middle of the pack when it comes to broadband availability. It's difficult to compare one state to another because the FCC's broadband availability data is very overstated. And in Michigan, we collect more granular, detailed information on availability. So our numbers are going to vary from, let's say, Indiana or Ohio or Wisconsin or Minnesota, Illinois, other states, just because we met differently than those other states do. There is no single great database at the federal level for broadband that's not overstated and full of errors. Um, when we can compare, Michigan does fall about in the middle of the pack. When we look at how households are subscribing to the internet or accessing the internet via data from the census, we find that about 70% of households in Michigan say that they have a fixed permanent broadband connection at home. So those are households that subscribe to cable, DSL, fixed wireless, or fiber technology. So if somebody is subscribed to one of those four types of services, and at any speed, it could be all the way up to a gigabyte per second, or all the way down to 4 megabits per second, which is available in some areas of the state. When you look at the technology, though, about 70% of households have that fixed permanent connection. Now, that doesn't mean that much infrastructure is available. That's just who subscribes, or the number of households that subscribe to it and actually have it in their home. When we start looking at that remaining 30% of households in Michigan, that's where we start breaking it down a little bit further to find out what are some of the challenges that these 30% of households are facing. If they don't have that fixed connection at home, what do they have? We find that there's a portion of households that subscribe to satellite service or even dial-up still. We still have about 15,000 households in Michigan that subscribe to dial-up. And so that group tells me that those households are seeking out an internet connection, but there's nothing more permanent available than satellite or dial-up. And so that tells me that's an infrastructure problem. When we look at the next group, we're looking at those who have a hotspot off their smartphone to serve multiple devices in their home. So, they might be running multiple laptops. They have kids that are doing virtual school and parents are teleworking or what some combination thereof. And so that they're running, again, multiple devices off a single mobile broadband hotspot. And that also tells me that's an availability issue where there's nothing more permanent available. And usually that option is more expensive than those more permanent connection types. The further we go down into this 30% of households, we find households that have a mobile broadband connection, but then only have a smartphone. So every access in that home, whether it's for parents or kids or anything in between, is done through a single smartphone device, and that's it. No laptops, no hard desktops, no other internet connected devices in the home except a smartphone. Usually when somebody is choosing a smartphone over having a permanent connection, it's an affordability issue because a smartphone is much more useful for a number of other things, especially on the go. And if you're working and traveling or going to school, it's great to have that. But usually they also can't afford that more permanent home connection. So that's why we see that smartphone only connectivity. The next group we find are those that the internet someplace else. So they don't have a smartphone, they don't have mobile broadband, they don't have a permanent home internet connection. So they go to a library, a school, a restaurant, a friend's house, a church, a senior center to access the internet from those locations. And then finally, the biggest group, the subgroup of this broader 30% of households are those that say they have no internet access whatsoever. Either it's not available to them, they can't afford it, they don't have a smartphone, they don't have mobile broadband, and they don't seek out the internet at at another location. Um, and those are the most troubling because those are the folks that have no access to the internet at all. And so when we look at these groups together, this 30% of households, we're talking about 1.25 million households in Michigan that fall into these different groups that describe their challenges. So some of them are again availability in rural areas where they're trying to make do with a hotspot or a satellite or dial up. And I know that a lot of rural Michigan struggles in that way. Um, but where those options aren't affordable, there's really nothing left for, and those are the households that don't have any internet access at all. So it's a big challenge in Michigan. So we're trying to solve not only the availability infrastructure problems, but also affordability as well, to really bring, to really reduce that 30% of households that aren't accessing the internet down to zero to close that digital divide.
When we talk about that 30%, Eric, geographically speaking, are there areas where there are larger quote unquote dead zones, right?
Yes, there are. I mean, we really are talking about rurality and where household density drops off as you move further and further from even from small town centers, moving away from suburban and urban areas on the fringes of our bigger cities, that service falls off. Um, Most of the time, 98% of the time, broadband is a private sector delivered utility, right? And because it's delivered by the private sector in that manner and is unregulated, there's they have to make a business case for expanding their networks or in building out into these unserved areas. And if the private sector could make money doing that, they would have done it by now. That's why we have service in some areas of their state and others that don't. Um, so part of this challenge is really solving that economics problem. We have to change the math essentially, where if demand is low, supply is going to be low. Supply being that connectivity. So how do we increase the supply even when demand is going to stay the same? And that's why federal subsidies have been doled out by the billions for broadband, and I think that's only going to continue. Um, that's why working with local and state elected officials to remove any barriers to broadband build out is essential as well. And that's why even at the local level, looking at how the public and the private sectors can collaborate to help change that equation. Those public-private partnerships have been very successful in expanding broadband across the state. And it takes a lot of that local initiative to help that along. So, we either increase demand, which means building a lot of houses in rural areas so that the supply goes up, or changing the economics of subsidies and putting money into increasing that supply, even though the demand stays the same. And so that's the biggest challenge. And when you look at rural areas, as you get more rural, the cost to build out service it increases exponentially the more rural you get. The graph of that cost looks like a big hockey stick. As you get closer to you know 1, 2, 3 households per mile and even less, the cost just rises astronomically. And so that's the curve that we need to try and flatten. Speaking of COVID and flattening curves, that's the curve that we need to flatten, is the cost of building out into those rural areas, in order to make sure everybody has the connectivity they need.
Eric, have you heard of any or seen any creative ways that rural communities are sort of banding together to solve this problem, or maybe individuals in rural communities have creatively tried to help themselves and potentially their neighbors with access to broadband?
Yeah, there's been a couple cases in Michigan and other states as well, where a community has worked with the wireless broadband kind of industry and providers. And what they've done is tried to identify what we call vertical assets. Which is just, industry slang for tall stuff. So what we're looking for are structures that can support wireless equipment in rural areas where if there's something already there, it requires you don't have to build a tower to provide wireless service. So if you can identify grain silos and elevators, water towers, tall buildings even that might exist in some of these, small towns or on the fringes of small towns. If you can identify those assets, it really helps the wireless internet service providers to be able to see if their equipment located on that structure can serve a greater population, and broadcast further out into rural areas. That's been successful in mid-Michigan. We've seen some vertical asset mapping from the community side up in the northeast part of the Lower Peninsula. Mapping those assets and getting that information out to internet service providers is helpful, so they can see what's available. And it takes partnerships like that to really help close that divide. And like I said, getting back to changing the economics, what can the public do to get involved? Mapping those assets doesn't take a lot of funding, for a community to get involved. And so there's kind of this whole spectrum of things communities can do, all the way up to, there was a rural township in Washtenaw County that passed their own millage to build infrastructure and then lease that infrastructure to an internet service provider. They didn't want to be the provider. They just, know they needed the infrastructure. So they helped get rid of that capital cost of building the network, and then had an ISP come in and lease that network to provide service. So there's a whole spectrum of things that can be done at the community level to improve broadband. And the vertical asset inventory is one of those that can help bring wireless providers to the table.
Excellent information to know. Thank you, Eric. And last question that I have today is, as we talk about moving the needle with rural access, particularly in that broadband space, is there anything that I as an individual can do? Are there resources, groups, individuals that you would encourage folks struggling with rural access to reach out to? Are there just ways for us to help in moving that needle?
All right. Yes, there are several things that an individual can do to help improve broadband locally. I mean, getting involved with, talking to your legislators, talking to policymakers, not only in Lansing, but in Washington as well, and letting them know how a lack of broadband impacts, especially your business. I mean, we need to make sure that our agriculture businesses can thrive in Michigan, and letting them know that, how you use broadband and why it's incredibly important that you need more than the bare minimum for connectivity, especially in these rural places, I think is really critical. But I think at the local level is where a lot of work can get done. Working with local elected officials, getting involved with any broadband planning teams that might get created at that local scale, I think is really important. We've worked with a number of counties and regions over the years to improve broadband. And so getting involved with those groups to advocate not only for yourself, but the others like you in those rural communities is where, you start to move that needle, especially at the local level when it comes to creating public-private partnerships and getting locals involved and better educated on why you need broadband. I think moves that needle a lot further up the chart when we can get, meaningful local action on broadband.
Awesome. Thank you, Eric. Thanks so much for joining us today, Eric. We really appreciate your insight and look forward to learning more from you during the live panel on May 5th.